Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. My name is Jamie Kirsch. I'm a senior lecturer of music here, director of choral activities, and it's my pleasure to introduce Marcus Pyle. First, I wanted to just say thank you. This is our last colloquium of the season. We've had four wonderful sessions, and I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our Tufts committee, Frank Lehman and Joe Honor, and of course Jeff Rowich and Peter Atkinson with the tech, and Rich Professor Jankowski's on the call as well. And it's been a great time working with everybody on this very different season. But it was a pleasure working with everybody to bring people like Marcus here. Marcus R. Pyle is the inaugural Franco Professor of the Humanities and Assistant Professor of Musicology at Davidson College, where he is also the Artistic Director of the Sloan Concert Series. Prior to his Davidson appointment, he served on the music faculty at Tufts and as a visiting scholar at MIT. Professor Pyle is a recipient of the Howard Mayer Brown Fellowship from the American Musicological Society, the Dean's Dissertation Award, and the Making a Difference Award, both from NYU. His research centers on depictions of femme fatale in French and German fin de siècle opera, intersections of gender and sexuality, music and espionage, and African American lives and music. His article, The Rhetoric of Seduction, or Materiality Under Erasure, can be found in 19th Century Music, and in his forthcoming article, Nina Simone as Poet and Orchestrator, Black Female Subjectivity and the Exoptic in Images and for Women, which will be published in the June issue of the Journal of Popular Music Studies. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Marcus R. Pyle.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for that introduction. Thank you to the Colloquium Committee for extending the invitation to have me back at Tufts virtually. I held out as long as I could. I asked for the kind of last date possible in hopes that we could be in person, but alas. And also thanks to Alex Kaplan for designing those really awesome posters and luring you all to this event. So today I will be presenting research titled Butch Fatale, Where Avoidance and the Punishment Against Abnormality in Berg's Lulu. This presentation draws from my current project, which evaluates female agency within depictions of femme fatale in fin de siècle operas. My contributions demonstrated in this talk are twofold. First, I provide an intervention into conventional and oppressive understandings of female agency by addressing the way in which character affects narrative and operatic conventions. Secondly, I produce a novel way of engaging with opera that refuses the arbitrary division between real and fictional. Instead, I argue that fictional characters are not just effects of language, but possess a relatively independent status that allows them to move freely across genre and media. For example, as I've written in my 19th century article, Salome's infamous Dance of the Seven Veils co-opts the orchestra and actually composes or orchestrates the music that we hear. And in the forthcoming Journal of Popular Music article that Jamie mentioned, I actually talk about how Nina Simone kind of orchestrates the coming into presence of the four women in Four Women, which each of those is based off of a stereotype of Black female being. These conceits together amount to an original mode of engagement with opera that allows me to answer the overriding question of today's talk. How does one avoid narrative impulses that aim to kill, defeat, and suppress? And how does that act of avoidance manifest sonically? My talk today is an investigation into the ways in which femme fatale tropes drive and manipulate formal elements. The infatuation with the femme fatale during the early 20th century was as much to do with the politics of women as it was, I argue, a way for generating friction in a narrative that produces and excuses modernist and outre works of art. Encoded in the femme fatale trope is the notion of an unremitting dissonance between oppositions. In other words, the femme fatale is not one thing or another, but is always both things and something in surplus of that sustained friction. And these built-in multiplicities can allow for monstrosities of form, bloated forms, and ruptures. When asking what prompts change in style or conventions in opera over a period of time, one answer, and the answer I'm interested in discussing today, is that forms morph because of the character's agential ability to resist interpellation. By interpellation, I mean specifically the process of bestowing qualities onto a thing in order to control or label it. The ability to queer formal elements by resisting interpellation, I argue, is a key facet to the revised agency of the femme fatale trope. So now that I've described the stakes and the broad questions that I seek to answer, let me take this time to state the progression of today's argument very succinctly. I will briefly explain butchness within the fin de siècle, exacting a queer close reading of historical examples of butchness, which will set me up to argue, one, the premise that power is everywhere, to cite Foucault, and that given that opera is representational, then power occurs within the stage world like other objects from the real world. Two, with that formulation, I will ask, how does power function in the stage world? How do characters attempt to evade it? And what are the sonic and musical stakes in avoiding power? Three, I will argue that evading power leads to narrative idiosyncrasies or glitches. Therefore, part of my aim is to explain to what extent the occurrence of certain narrative forms, especially those within operas featuring femme fatale, are a consequence of epistemological shifts in character or characterization, shifts that cause forms to try to accommodate, sequester, thwart, open, proliferate, or erase characters that resist conventional forms. To demonstrate this, I turn to Alban Berg's Lulu. Lulu tells the story of a well-to-do femme fatale who works her way through a motley crew of lovers until the devastating stock market crash of 1873 that leaves Lulu down and out on the streets of London, working as a penurious prostitute, then killed at the hands of Jack the Ripper. The first half of the opera is a study in Viennese decadence, the second, a portrait of back alley London impoverishment. Linking the two symmetrical halves of the opera is the film interlude, a silent film that shows Lulu's imprisonment for the murder of Beauty, also known as Dr. Shun. All of Lulu's casualties in the first half return anew as Johns. Lulu remains unchanged, however, the Erdgeist, the adaptable and invincible spirit of woman. Depictions of the femme fatale have always been enveloped in allusions to improper ideals of femininity, either an abuse of excessive femininity, a disregard of contemporaneous ideals of feminine comportment, or an embodiment and invoicing of the masculine. The butch is evident in the defiance of Carmen, who remarks that she thinks in song, deconstructing the binary of masculine logos and feminine phone. It is evident in the character Zambinella from Sarfacen, the supposed epitome of feminine beauty, who turns out to be a castrato. The unnaturalness and brutishness of Miss Evelyn Abal from Auguste Villiers de l'Isle Adam's Lève Futur, who, beneath her cosmetics and wigs, has a mannish visage. The idealized female mannequin from Georges Méliès's 1903 silent film Illusion Funambulesque, who once brought to life turns into a male cook, or Salome, who compels Carolyn Abate to ask whether, quote, whether Salome is revealed when the final veil falls as a man, not literally a biological man, but bearing nonetheless some frightening sign of maleness, end quote. And it is evident in the characterization of Alban Berg's Lulu, who moonlights as Perrault Lunaire and seduces and later becomes the lesbian Countess Geschwitz. These references, and there are many more, allude to tropes of female embodied masculinity, butchness, duplicity, and misapprehension.
And Marcus, I hate to interrupt you, but
yeah.
Are your slides not projecting? I'm only seeing the
first I'm sorry.
For presentation.
Can you see them now? Ah, okay.
Now it says theoretical formulation of Butch.
All right.
Great.
The others were just summaries of my bullet points, but these are videos and photos, so I'll go back over them. So this is Carmen Zambanella from Sarrazin, Evelyn Abal, and Salome from Ken Russell's Salome's Last Dance, and Lulu as Perrault. Thank you. If there are any other problems, let me know. Okay. Themes of butchness in the context of depictions of dangerous femininity relate directly to the origins of the term butch. Etymologically, butch, which is a corrupted abbreviation of boucher or butcher, describes a brutal murderer, one who kills indiscriminately or cruelly. That's from around 1520. Boucher, linguistically and artistically, is linked to the homonymous play between bouche, mouth, muzzle, penis, and boucher, blocked, obstructed, choked, or closing and opening. So butch exists as an entity that is oppressed, minoritarian, but nevertheless is cloaked in the vestments of the narrative law, which I take to be aesthetic manifestations of power within a work. The butch fatale, therefore, becomes a site of contention. The butch exists as an assemblage of lawlessness and the rule of the punisher. What I coin here as butch fatale exists as a mode of being femme fatale, the temporary existence both within and without the law, which as a narrative trope leads to the occurrence of expanded formal elements. I'm extending Jack Halberstam's line of critique that says, quote, lesbian masculinities have always encompassed a multiplicity of forms, end quote. That multiplicity with Lulu represents a way of avoiding the condemnation of a normative power. It is not that butchness is an in-betweenness that allows for consistent adaptation and evasion. It is, however, a state of being that adapts based on difference. It replicates ruptures, and in those ruptures is perhaps a space to be free or to exist. Whereas the femme fatale is a representation or exploitation of a minoritarian positionality, the butch fatale, femme homme, is an embodiment of a minoritarian position passing as majoritarian. What I mean to suggest by this is the butch fatale adopts certain signifiers of hegemony, musical, sociocultural, vocal, etc., in order to bypass or distort standard narrative forms. Crucially, I'm not suggesting that the butch fatale simply imitates the majoritarian object of her desire, but instead enters into a coeval involution, where an involution involves a dissolution of form that frees times and speeds and thus makes possible the dance of disparate things. Lulu herself, we could call a garçon manqué, a tomboy, or literally a failed boy. But the failure is not one of phallic lack. The failure is not even one of agential failure. Rather, Lulu fails to be interpolated. She is a garçon manqué, a body or a boy missed by power. And garçon manqué is one of the French terms for a butch or tomboy that was circulating around the time that Lulu was premiered. This is primarily indicated by Lulu's fashioning as Perrault, himself a failure in love and life. My theory suggests that one way to alter prescriptive power or law is to become legible as law-abiding, therefore avoiding punishment for registering as transgressive, and thus to resist interpretation is to resist interpolation. So given that opera is representational, power is everywhere. Opera is the theatrical and representational working through, Durcharbeiten, of societal impulses. The totality of opera is representational, even though it's widely agreed that the component parts are not necessarily so. Drama is the ritualistic and pretend acting out of events on stage. Opera is a metaphor for the living. The characters exist within scenarios with backgrounds, depth, within a fictional world that is governed by and responds to forces internal and external. Certainly, this tradition extends into the past with aesthetic traditions from the early modern, such as Theatrum Mundi, and into the modernist era with concepts of meta-theater as evident in the works of Bertolt Brecht, Jean Genet, and J.M. Barrie. These ideas suggest that stage life and real life are not two mutually exclusive worlds. In fact, most of these theories suggest metaphorically that stage life is real life and real life is stage life. Drama on stage becomes a microcosm of real issues, real events, and real people. Taken that opera is representational, then discursive power is prevalent and interminable. At every stage of the conception, production, and reception, power exists. Here, power is represented as the discursive assemblage, an intersectional force that wins its way into and onto a body, making and marking subjects. Foucault's concept of the phantasmic force wherein, quote, all power can do is forbid and all it can command is obedience. Power ultimately is repression. Repression ultimately is the imposition of the law. The law ultimately demands submission. Power is that which is intangible and works to fabricate actualities. Power in itself is an effect of immaterial manifesting materially. And analytics of power within opera would begin with material conditions that are inflected in narrative, the structure of language or a sequence of events that may evoke verisimilitude, exaggeration, transgression. A librettist composer's choices of speech, paying attention to the vocality and singability of a text, perhaps informed by contemporaneous biological investigations, might lead to truncated vocal lines for female singers because of contemporaneous or fashionable corsets or comparatively meager lung capacities, as they thought during the early 19th century, 20th century. This exemplifies the propulsion of power and its material effects. By investigating the dramaturgical representations of discursive power, I show how power relations can materially penetrate the body in depth. If power takes hold on the body, it's not through its having first to be interiorized in people's consciousness. In terms of narrative representation, there are a couple of instances of proof that suggest Berg inserted himself into this fictional world. Berg is a figure of compositional authority. Berg, represented as Alva, the composer within the stage world, aims to chasten Lulu. In Act 1, Scene 3, Alva is musing about his composition, and the orchestra quotes the very beginning of Wozzeck. We also know that Alva seeks to dominate or control Lulu because of his musical signature. The tone row associated with him plays underneath the animal trainer in the prologue. And crucially, Alva lauds Lulu's body as forms. He amended the Vatican text to describe Lulu's body as forms that occur in Berg's actual own lyric suite. And it becomes clear that one way power interpolates the body is by formalizing it. Up to this point, I have explained that power is ubiquitous in this representational form. I want to turn now to how power is represented within opera. The form of power that I'm addressing in this talk is disciplinary power. This occurs within the plot, with Lulu being sent to prison for murder and with the retributive murder of Lulu by Jack the Ripper. Disciplinary power also rears its head in terms of the consistent and controlling gaze at the portrait of Lulu as an attempt to frame her as the desire of whoever looks at the portrait. Each character's fawning appraisal of Lulu's portrait conveys to the audience what the predominant methods of power are within each scene. But Lulu resists. She exists outside of the frame of the portrait. Even her murder takes place off stage. Her refusal to dance is a refusal to take stage. And similarly, her escape from prison occurs in a filmic montage interlude. At every juncture, Lulu evades carceral discipline by constantly reimagining herself. Power functions as a self-reflexive knowledge that leads to disclosing aspects of identity. This disclosing often occurs in the benefit of power. Foucault explains that power derives its potency from compelling subjects to out themselves, to divulge information, to implicate themselves. We will now address a musical example of this, where we will see a character attempting to compel Lulu into a confession of abnormality and Lulu's sonic evasion. In Lulu, the men are represented by repetitive and contrived musical forms: sonata form, rondo, theme, and variations. The repetitiveness of these forms aim to interpolate Lulu, but Lulu lives in song forms, cyclical perhaps, but freer in form and older in origin. In the Paris scene of the opera, Act 3, Scene 1, after Lulu has traded identities with Geschwitz and is now on the lam, the Marquis tries to traffic her into a ring of prostitution. In the theme and 12 variations that frame this scene, there are two crucial intermezzi introduced between the second and third variations. The first is a quote of Wedekin's own cabaret theme, Confession. And the second is a truncated version of Lulu's lead. The multivalent inclusion of the song Confession, whose original lyrics are not presented in the opera, details the pleasures and freedoms of a life of prostitution. The melody of Wedekin's Confession forms the theme of variations. We observe that power is deployed here as variations, each one seeking to out Lulu. Her evasiveness leads to other variations. The quotation of the Wedekind cabaret song cycles through an implied circle of fifths and sets up a resolution, bait for the taking. Nevertheless, Lulu elides the cadence, evades tonality, and escapes interpolation. Lulu rests the moment from one of passe harmonic progression, which is a circle of fifths here, and into the queer and now with the generation of dissonance. So I'm going to play the example of this, and I'm going to start at the tail end of the Marquis singing, compelling Lulu into this prostitution trafficking and Lulu's evasion of it. So when Lulu comes in, she is breaking the circle of fifths, the cycle of fifths, and evading that tonality altogether. Okay, could we hear that? Okay, good. Other scholars have discussed the relationship between prostitution and contemporaneous ideologies of marriage, but no scholars have mentioned that this is the Marquis's attempt to elicit an actual confession, biographical or moral facts from Lulu. So the Marquis tries again, and in the next interdiction, or these kinds of between sayings, the Marquis quotes music from Lulu's lead, the lead der Lulu, Lulu's most personal and autobiographical moment in the opera. That's what Judy Lockhead refers to it as. The Marquis in this scene becomes Lulu in order to get her to submit to ideals of constructed and conventional relationships. But queer Lulu destroys all of these attempts, destroying the 5-1 resolution, destroying old world tonality, destroying notions of woman as a performer, indicated by the lyrics of Confession and the medium in which it would have been presented at a cabaret. And it destroys the closed system of the theme and variations form. Lulu, in this sense, disidentifies with the formal elements and creates an expanded form, one that exemplifies the queer art of failure. Lulu here again represents the failure to submit, and in so doing forces the Marquis to sing herself, to vocally become Lulu. And he starts adopting lyrics from her lead to Lulu in order to compel her into sharing information. There's another occurrence of theme and variations preceding the one just discussed. In both cases, the form occurs while interrogating Lulu. And remember, the theme and variations are attempts to interpolate Lulu, and the variations proliferate or expand because of her circumventions. In the duet of Act 1, Scene 1, after the death of Dr. Goll, Lulu's aloofness is questioned by the painter, her soon-to-be new lover. He asks, "Can you not speak the truth?" And Lulu responds, "I do not know." In this duet, Patricia Hall dissects the fragmentation of the tone row and their manipulation. But what is left unaddressed is the interplay between the characters. At first, Lulu repeats the pitches of the painter in reply, and this is indicated in blue, the circles in blue. Painter first, then Lulu. Importantly, the words truth and creator are orchestrated with the pitches from the source row, whereas the antecedent phrase featuring the pronoun do is always supported by the pitcher chords. This seems to imply that the painter doesn't have access to Lulu's true nature. Instead, he's just going on based off of what he gleans from the portrait. In both cases, Lulu answers the question with a direct repetition of the painter, a non-answer. The painter's attempts fail, and by the third question, the roles have reversed in yellow there. The pitches that Lulu sings become the source material for the painter's reply, which is a retrograded response to Lulu. She overtakes the authority of the painter and redirects the entire trajectory of the Inquisition. Lulu opens with a critical misrepresentation. Under the big tent, in front of the stage curtain, the velvet divider of the stage world and the audience, the ringleader introduces us to Lulu. She is fetched and brought from off stage by the ringleader's stagehand. Lulu, the serpent, materializes. Only Lulu, the serpent, is dressed in the attire of Pierrot. She is snake, clown, and woman or man. In this stage blocking, we must ask, what is being blocked? In this prologue, a narrative black site, a site of exception, why is Lulu rendered voiceless and immobile? And so we must contend with this extraordinary rendition of the body. Only the nomadic connotations of the circus, the domesticated savagery of the menagerie, and the absurdity of this Wunderkammer of beings could be appropriate for this prologue. Displaced persons and creatures are brought together temporarily for entertainment. Lulu comes to us as an anachronism and not dressed for the occasion, presented as a serpent, dressed as a harlequin, a harlot, or erlot, which means vagabond or someone with no fixed occupation, or rogue. She's already outfitted for the first scene of the opera, but present in an altogether different temporality. Do the characters behind the grand drape miss her? Or is the ringleader's goon, called Arbeiter, responsible for setting the characters in motion, which is potentially exemplified by the imperative demand to his stagehand to return Lulu back to her place, Mach, frag sie ihren Platz. Is Herr Arbeiter responsible for the motivisch-thematische Arbeit of Lulu, the fragmentation, dislocation, and recontextualization of motivic material? Within this opening prologue, Lulu has been broken down and rendered a motif, a partiality with potential. From this, we begin to see the ensuing operatic drama as simply an acting out of characters trying to nail her down, fix her in place. Nevertheless, Lulu appears from another time and place. This act of displacement and disjuncture is metaphor, a carrying over of Lulu from one world into another. For Paul Ricoeur, metaphor, quote, guarantees the very transference of meaning and gives poetic language its characteristic of semantic plus value, its capacity to be open toward new aspects, new dimensions, new horizons, new meanings. This talk addresses what exactly those advantages are and how this evasion generates certain sonic and narrative glitches. What I argue is that the proliferation of metaphor, by which I mean a presentation of something as something, or making something out to be what it is not, allows for infinite assemblages that fall outside of systems of standard expectation, linguistic, scientific, philosophical, sociological, cultural. And for that reason, metaphor poses a threat to the potency of discursive power. In an attempt to maintain a stronghold, discursive power deploys myriad permutations that aim to eradicate said metaphors. Power seems to fire off and misfire, trying to seek out the minoritarian glitch. Sometimes it fails. Montage can be said to resist grand narratives, resist interpretation, and resist temporality. As Patricia McBride argues, quote, narrative can be described as a discursive practice, end quote. And with this statement, she highlights the ways in which narratives shape and are shaped by societies and cultures. The argument presented here has built from McBride's point by suggesting that not only is narrative a discursive practice, but discursive power itself also shapes narrative. It represents an ever-changing nexus of hierarchy, social and cultural apparatuses, juridical systems, taboo, myth, courtesy, comportment, etc. Just like montage that never solidifies into an overarching viewpoint, power endlessly morphs and mutates to compartmentalize, codify, censor, or compel. The modernist utilization of montage derives from contestations with power. Within montage and the way it functions is an inherent ability to revise and reshape the object. Certain parts are able to be excised, foregrounded, backgrounded, and layered. Montage is anarchy of the image. Stable meanings escape the construction of the montage. It's always in flux and always elusive. For this reason, montage becomes one of the predominant artistic modes of political critique and avoiding condemnation by censors. To be overladen with meaning, or to subvert meaning altogether becomes a powerful tool in framing social political ideologies. Just as well, the metaphor of montage is one that presumes and enacts a politics of rebuilding, building anew and building on layers of meaning, that parallels the thrust toward rebuilding systems of power. Sentiments of reconstruction or construction and the political efficacy of the mounted image presage a movement toward inclusion and away from predominant ideals of state power. Within montage is a move away from hierarchy. These literal assemblages of disparate times, materials, techniques, bodies, and angles assure that no one interpretation takes hold. It evades the heavy-handed hermeneutics of structures of power. And it is precisely in this way that the Butch Fatale operates. Butch is a concatenation of socially constructed ideologies of normalcy, masculinity, and power that are deployed in a way to subvert those categories. As the Butch Fatale is present in opera and narrative, her ability to evade stable meanings is owed to her layered constructions of selfhood. Both Butch and Montage, especially within the fin de siècle, exemplify a theory of avoidance, avoiding being engulfed and oppressed within hegemonic power structures. Butchness is a decentralized assemblage of indexes of power. Butchness is the anarchical assemblage of a body. But instead of order without power, the definition of anarchy, the Butch Fatale is disorder with power. And the Butch Fatale is any character or trope that dons some semblance of power in order to dodge normalization, suppression, and erasure. Doing so, however, antithetically causes power to refigure itself and attempt again to seek out and eradicate this radical other. Power's attempts to seek and destroy are nullified by the various guises of the Butch Fatale. Montage too plays with disparities. Butch also capitalizes on disparity. So while Lulu is literally immobilized on stage during the prologue, unable to move, before speech, unable to assert herself, she is figuratively highly mobile as pure spectacle. She takes the stage as pure spectacle, laden with multiple symbols, pointing to various temporalities and various theatrical genres. Lulu is the prostitute whose occupation is to refigure herself and her body to the pleasures of her callers. The prologue exploits the desire of the audience, in this way asking, what tickles your fancy? And throughout the opera, we watch as Lulu remakes herself to avoid being pinned down by love, lust, and law, evidenced by Lulu being cast within a motley array of roles throughout the opera: snake, Pierrot, prostitute, lover, widow, and even named Eva, Nella, Nellie, and Mignon. This combination of perspectival relations disabuses narrative of singular meaning and instead moves more toward a drastic sense of self, one that emphasizes an engagement with music as tantamount to an engagement with the phenomenal world and its inhabitants. What the Montage Butch Fatale presents is in contention with Judith Butler, who sees the solidification of gender and sex as an effect of reproducing directives of power. Butler argues that the embodiment of shame as a will toward normalcy solidifies gender categories. To resist this, Butler argues subjects can destabilize these socially constructed systems by engaging in acts of parody. But parody, the act of mimicking that undercuts artificial categories, must balance between similitude and dissimilitude, in my opinion. To be too dissimilar without the parodic subject as that which power must normalize. To be too similar is simply to self-inscribe is simply a self-inscription of power. Lulu, and indeed other femmes fatales, consistently negotiate the space between being marked and unmarked. Instead of replicating or emboldening power with off-kilter imitations, the Butch Fatale seeks to avoid power altogether. The ability to exist between marked and unmarked categories is what alters power. It creates a deferral of power. Power for the time being becomes something anew in an attempt to trawl for non-normative subjects yet again. So where does formulating this contestations with discursive power lead to formal glitches leave us? In music and literary studies, I build on the current interventions of Carolyn Levine, as I argue that musical forms and social political forms are innately linked. Not only are they linked, but they also shape each other, forging a connection between superficial appearance and social meaning, bridging the gap between aesthetic critique and materialist intervention. This research also has the potential to influence the renewed interest in character study within literary studies. Two key points would develop from this line of critique. One, that aesthetics is interrelated to materiality, and two, that form is an extension of and influence of sociopolitical apparatuses. Today's talk has carved out a space in which to ask how character affects form and how the pressures of character have led to avant-garde techniques. From this, we can begin to ask questions such as, do characters have mind? And if so, what does that allow musicologists to say about the ways in which works of art function or take shape? And now, what work remains to be done? A material and cultural genealogy of the Butch, masculine femininity, as they figure throughout the fin de siècle, remains to be done. There's been insufficient work done on the persecution of and masquerading of Butch Fatales during the fin de siècle. I would also be interested in uncovering the histories of Butch musicians who were, in an effort to avoid being a pariah or to avoid persecution, had to modify their mode of existence. This is evident, for example, in the performance practices of Gertrude Ma Rainey's Prove It On Me Blues from 1928, where one of the lyrics says, "They said I do it, ain't nobody caught me, sure gotta prove it on me." Place on suspicions of abnormality and compels listeners to try to out her through song. Musicology's current interest in the history of sciences could also be extended with this work by gathering archival artifacts pertaining to sex differences within pulmonology, sexology, and even contemporaneous fashion. For example, how were the costumes that were envisioned or in vogue said to affect what was possible vocally as a question of biopower as it appears within the stage world? And power, insofar as it is made manifest on the stage, allows us to ponder the possible presence of hyperobjects within the stage world. Air, the necessary substance for vocalization, is thought to be real and something that is wholly exempt from philosophical consideration of operatic dramaturgy. That is to say, it's taken for granted that the stage characters, the dramatis personae, vocalize because of access to real air. And so that's another way that divide between reality and fiction is destroyed. Though today I focused on opera, the application of this argument goes beyond the concert hall. Within the context of politics, this research allows for a new model of political engagement. It sees subjects of state power, say, as part of a feedback loop with that power. And it may be true that theoretical frameworks by themselves don't solve problems, but they do provide useful tools for analysis and useful strategies for social and cultural preservation of life. The same criteria used in narratology to determine whether a fictional character is said to exist are the same criteria used to determine to what extent real people are said to exist. Are you different from or dangerous to a normative power? Then you must not exist. Do people have difficulty empathizing with you? Then you must not exist. Do you fall outside the jurisdiction of certain social structures, laws, or borders? Then you must not exist. And where I say you must not exist, I'm referring to the imperative by those in power to erase these characters. Every step is taken to ensure they retain their fictional status, to maintain that they are ephemeral, not worthy of being bestowed rights, not worthy of being accepted into the polis. In an effort to mitigate this, disenfranchised people have turned to these narratives as strategic texts that display productive resilience and defiance. Marginalized people have embodied these operas and texts in order to exact subtle political critique against systems that have a stake in the fictionalization of minoritarians. And as such, opera represents a textbook on how to avoid and overcome domineering societal and political pressures. Thank you. So now I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Marcus. We've been at this point we've been kind of unmuting and giving a well-deserved round of applause, kind of in person as best we can.
Thank you.
And yes, now we're happy to have questions. And I think if you would use your little hand raise emoji, we can I can certainly call on people and try to keep it going, okay? Joe, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, Marcus. I was really glad to hear that presentation, and I I think one of the amazing things about Berg's music and this piece is that, and I think you gave a really good way of talking about it, that he creates all these incredibly elaborate structures which seem like they should just make the work freeze in its tracks, like the palindromes and the retrogrades and the shared characters, and he does that in other pieces as well. But that's never the effect of the music. It doesn't ever become as static and frozen as it seems like it would. And I think your presentation really does a great job of sort of explaining all the things that are sort of going against the power of the structure and the power of the structure to do that, sort of the way those two things interrelate. I kept thinking about just the Countess role, and I've seen a number of stage productions over the years, and the Countess is always like this character that seems like they're hard to stage. Like she's kind of often lurking around on the edges of the thing, and then it's surprising that she's the one there at the end. But so I don't know if there's a question there, but just about, like, it seems like she is always kind of resisting even being in the opera almost. So, and
Yeah.
it's a challenge to stage her. So,
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that. So Berg was also confused about the role of the Countess. If you look at his manuscript, autograph manuscript, he had a different ending in mind that had a different conception of the role of the Countess, and he scratched it. And I think what Silvio de los Santos writes about this, the changes that he made were probably done so to avoid censorship, because of presenting her as kind of a more overt lesbian, and putting her as putting her front and center in a trope of kind of grief at the loss of Lulu. So he changed the ending of the opera, but that was a role that gave him a lot of strife. He toyed with it quite often. And let's see, if you think of Lulu and Geschwitz and the amount of mirroring that's involved between the two characters and how they switch roles throughout, even in the filmic interlude, it makes sense that his problems with Lulu are also his problems with the Countess. And so he struggled with putting both of them on stage, and everything that happens off stage for the Countess happens off stage for Lulu, in a sense. She refuses to dance. Her death happens off stage, and she doesn't kind of get the final moments on stage to resolve her death. But she does, in that sense, it leaves an out for her to kind of live on in the narrative, in a sense. So yeah, there's overlap between Countess Geschwitz and Lulu in terms of the action taking place off stage and kind of evading being front and center. And also, yeah, just the way Berg rethought the Countess's role is very interesting. And Silvio has a good chapter on that.
yeah, really captures the rupture that's built into the character. It's not like Berg resolved it, so that's great.
Right, and it seems that Countess Geschwitz was also modeled off of Smaragda, his sister, who was an out lesbian woman at the time. And so he also may have changed the ending of the opera to kind of protect her, even though she was out. In her circle, it was acceptable, but in the grand scheme of things, it may not have been.
Great. Well, thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcus. This was just wonderful.
Thank you.
I don't want to put words in your mouth or mischaracterize your work, but would you say sort of that Lulu has the potential to be empowering or liberatory? I mean, given the subject matter and the sort of abjection with which the character is treated towards the end, it seems like that may have to pressure some of the aspects of the text. But, and here's the question, in the history of performances of this work and stagings, are there more or less empowering, more or less subversive, or alternatively problematic or objective kinds of performances that you've noted over the past 40 or so years?
I don't think it's putting words in my mouth. I think it is an empowering work. If you look beyond just the surface narrative that you're being presented, I think it's pretty empowering. She does kind of make a life for herself, literally make it. And she continues to survive in impossible situations. So I think that's empowering. And the way she kind of refashions herself is empowering. I don't want to say that she's a role model. So I'll go so far as to say she's empowering, but without being a role model. And I think that's important to say. And as far as productions that present a kind of, did you say a more empowering or?
More or less.
Yeah. I think any productions where I've seen the productions that usually don't take into account the really kind of detailed stage descriptions that Berg writes, where she is dressed as Perrault, where she is, what is it, off stage for certain moments, or the really detailed scene where she is, where all of her lovers are kind of brought into one room, and it's kind of that, it's kind of body comedy. It's almost like a sitcom where people are hiding behind the curtains. All of her lovers are hidden behind different pieces of furniture, where they don't take into consideration those stage markings. Those kind of fall flat for me, because it seems that Berg is really considering, he's very intentional about how she's supposed to look and how she's supposed to present in every moment of the opera, down to the timing, I think, with the filmic montage, and especially in that scene that I was just discussing, down to the second with the music. It's saying this character peeks out from behind the curtains. I think it's the school teacher, the gym teacher or something like that, down to the specific minutes in the composition. So there are some productions that just ignore that, and those fall flat for me.
That's interesting, because now it seems like, although Lulu in the context, like within the diegesis, is an extremely liberated and self-determining character, in like the best productions, it's still Berg and his instructions are like minutely controlling her, right?
Yeah, there's this, well, I mean, if it were not for Berg, you're right, there's a fine line there. If it were not for Berg, she would not exist. So, but for Berg and Wedekind, she would not exist. But it's the amount to which she exists, the extent to which she exists within a role, that I'm interested in tracing. So, for example, Berg is interested in writing, so the theme and variations example that I gave, to my knowledge, I don't know of any other theme and variations where there is a intermezzo between variations. And for me, it seems like that was a decision that was made in collaboration with the character of the femme fatale, or something that was necessitated because of her slipperiness as a character. And so it kind of pushed Berg to expand and rethink form. If you look at Wozzeck and compare it to Lulu, there are a lot of similarities, but the changes that make Lulu more avant-garde and more modernist, I think arise because of the inclusion of the femme fatale and the fact that she's always constantly evading people and different structures, and that forced him to rethink the formal elements of his opera. And so, so yes, there's an interplay between Berg and Lulu on the level of the creation of the story, and then also because he inserted himself into the drama, there's also that level of interplay between the two characters.
I see. Thank you. I mean, I can sort of revise my own perspective now that although Berg was the one writing the stage directions and controlling the sort of music development, what you're saying, I take it, is that Lulu is so big and sort of exists prior to, in a way, as an archetype or as a character that exceeds even Berg's imaginations. She's sort of writing through him. That's
yeah.
Fanciful, I'm sorry, but
no, I think that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. Yeah, people will call me crazy, but that's okay. I've heard worse, so that's okay. But I do think that that's true. That the character kind of exists in excess of what the author function, to cite Foucault, had in mind.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for a few more.
I can ask another question. It's maybe a little bit less scholarly.
Sure.
But I am curious, what led you to this work and this opera in particular, as a kind of, it's canonical, but maybe somewhat on the margins as an unfinished work. And like, was there an aha moment for you? If you just sort of always loved Lulu and always loved Berg?
I've pretty much always loved Berg's Lulu. I don't know why. I don't remember when I first saw it. I think the first time I talked about it in a kind of scholarly way was at Juilliard with Joel Sachs. He taught a class called the Modernist Era, and we talked about it, and that was really kind of eye-opening to me and set me down this path. But it's always been one of my favorite operas, just because of it's a slow burn, and it's something that's interesting every time you watch it. Every time you watch it, you get something new. And there's so many different ways into the opera. I mean, historical, literary, then talking about Berg and all of the changes that he made to the opera, talking about gender and sexuality. So there are a bunch of different avenues, and it seems like an endlessly generous opera. So that's one of the things that got me into Lulu. And the kind of fantastical quality of the opera, the fact that she's killed by Jack the Ripper at the end of the opera, it's wonderfully strange.
We have plenty of time. We have a couple.
I don't want to dominate the Q&A here, but I have more questions. Someone else should definitely pipe up though, if you'd like.
It's okay. All right. I would ask. Well, I mean, I would ask one. Marcus, is there a production that the students and myself included? I probably have only seen it. I haven't seen Lulu one time. Is there a production that we can access now, whether it's a DVD, or is there one that encapsulates what you've just spoken about today? In case, I mean, again, I'm speaking for myself. I haven't seen it very often either, and I would love to watch it now that I've heard your talk.
Yeah, As far as what's available now, I'm not sure, but there is, I'll have to look it up, but my favorite production, actually, I'll send an email with a link to my favorite production, because I can't remember it off
Oh,
of
no worries.
the
Of
top
course.
of my head,
No problem.
but it's definitely not available because I checked on this. It's not available online, but you can get it as a DVD, and it's probably in the Tufts library. So I can send a link to the call number. But
Thank you very much.
it's a German production, I believe, and just the way that Lulu is slithering throughout the opera is really fascinating to me, and it's just really well done. The costumes, the acting, the singing is all terrific. So I can't remember
No worries.
at the
Thanks.
moment.
If I could ask another question, then, if you'll entertain it. Well, first of all, is there something about the fin de siècle Germany, the first 3 or so decades, that it's not just Lulu or even just Salome? It seems like this is a kind of trope of the problematic boundary pushing woman that has these ties to centuries worth of accumulated culture in figure of Harlequin or biblical culture even. What is it? It's a gigantic historical cultural question. What is it about Germany in these decades that seems to coax this kind of narrative and this kind of character out of certain artists? And then relatedly, like, do you see there being any clear musical or even just dramatic or pop culture successors to Lulu in the way that she embodies some of the um, subversive or slippery traits as you define them?
Okay, good. Yeah. So the first part of the question was, what about this moment in time leads to femme fatale in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the embodiment and kind of unresolved quality of two-ness or duplicity for these modernist composers that is freeing, and also something that they can use as a stepping stone, or something that they didn't know that they were using as a stepping stone towards expanded formal elements. But for me, it's the unresolved duplicity that's built in. So the tension between virgin whore, between man and woman, virtus voluptus, all of these different qualities that affect that are built into what it means to be a femme fatale. The trope of a usurper of language. So the femme fatale is someone who usurps men's speech, was something that was fascinating to people. The idea of hysteria seemed like the femme fatale is, on the one hand, a character that is kind of a playground for teasing out the tension between those two poles, and also is kind of a receptacle for contemporaneous thought, especially like psychology and Freudian psychology in terms of hysteria and dangerous femininity, and suffrage. And, if you were given, for example, at the same time, the German Empire, which was relatively small compared to other empires, was worried about the fragmentation of its empire and the spreading out. And so the femme fatale becomes kind of a symbol of a fragmented empire, something that's gotten too out of control, that's too wily and dangerous. And the femme fatale also became a symbol of if women were given power, that would be bad for the empire because it would lead to depopulation, because they would not want to procreate. And so it was all of these ideas kind of got thrown into what it means to be a femme fatale. So it seems like everything of the moment was read onto the femme fatale, and also she evaded all of those because you can't pin her down on one side or the other. Is she indicative of depopulation, or is she indicative of, as you mentioned, kind of an empowering woman? So it kind of, it goes both ways. And I think the it goes both ways aspect is what attracted people to that type trope. Yeah.
All right. If there are any last questions, or we can stop and say another big thank you to Marcus. This was just wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.